to talk about a research project that I'm involved in called Growing Up on the Streets. And this particular research explores the lives of young people living on the streets in 3 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Accra in Ghana in West Africa, Bukavu in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Harare in Zimbabwe. This is a collaborative, longitudinal research project which emerged as a response to unanswered questions regarding what happens to young people who never leave the street. And it also followed on from the UN OHCHR Resolution 1612 call for more research to explore the lived realities of street-connected young people in order that they might better realise their rights on the street. We're still very much in the process of data collection. We're collecting data over 3 years, and so we are only starting to touch on our analysis, and so these are very preliminary emerging findings that I'm going to present, so please just bear that in mind as I go on. I'll give a little bit of background to the project as a whole, the aims, a little bit on the methodology, before then focusing a little bit on some emerging findings regarding sexual exploitation on the streets. And I'm going to focus in particular on Bukavu in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the experiences of a group of girls who are aged 14 to 18, although I will point out that only 2 of these girls were 18. And we're probably only talking about the data from the first 6 months of the research, as it takes time to come through. But there is still a lot there. So just a little bit of background on street-connected young people. Perhaps one of the most visible signs of poverty and marginalisation in urban environments. But yet, despite significant interventions and policy changes around children's rights, at national and international levels, Michel Peretti highlights that street-connected children are consistently failed in terms of being able to access their rights. Much of the international legislation draws on the Western conceptualizations of childhood, which prioritise protected innocence and place children within a family context. And street children, therefore, who fell outside this were considered out of place on the streets and unable to access their rights. So, therefore, you have this inability to adequately define and therefore understand who we're talking about. And that's placed street-connected young people outside the policy arena. Lack of formal representation as a group makes them much more difficult to fit into targets and measures of success. And independent status places them outside recognised channels of protection. Difficult to get medical care without adults taking you there, for example. And this presents a difficulty in developing research. And so we have aimed to address this through our project, looking at individual needs and seeing how this has been identified as a weakness in current provision. So on this slide I have the aim of the research, which was really to understand street children and youth's capabilities on the street and to seek better ways of supporting them to have adult lives of value. And we had 3 specific research questions, one of which was to explore the difficulties that young people face as they grow up in the streets in order to think about how they might be better supported. And from our data so far, sexual exploitation is one significant difficulty that is faced by young people in this regard. So our framework then draws on the capabilities approach, the work of Amartya Sen and Martin Osborne, and we're looking to see beyond the manifestations of poverty and life on the street to those aspects of life that young people have most reason to value. The approach has been tailored for street children to explore the conditions that enable and constrain choice and the freedoms they have to create a life they value. So with participatory engagement, we worked with the young people in the project and developed 10 capability statements that they identified which reflected aspects of life that they said was most important to them as they struggle to build adult lives. These are listed on the slide. The ones that I've highlighted in red are those that particularly are impacted on by sexual exploitation, which I'll come on to a little bit later. But of course, these capabilities are not isolated aspects of life, and they're all interwoven with each other. And of course, there are other things that didn't make it into these young people's top 10, which we are also still coding for in our data. But for example, health is affected by availability of shelter, food dependent on economic activity, etc., etc. And this identifies the complex and relational nature of street life, through which various forms of sexual exploitation emerged in our data as a significant barrier to creating lives of value. So then, turning to this issue, despite Article 34 of the CRC outlining children's right to protection from all forms of sexual exploitation, it's still a serious issue. And I know we're going to be discussing in the next 3 days conceptual understandings, gender norms, and I don't really want to go into that, but I do want to highlight that initial literature searches, and we still have to do much more of this, have a few points to frame my discussion. First of all, in terms of sexual exploitation against young people in sub-Saharan Africa, we're identifying this to be a contested term, bridging a gap between abuse and work, or sex work-related issues. The key issue obviously being the exchange. We haven't so far identified a huge number of literature reviews outside South Africa, but obviously there's significant suggestions around exploitation related to AIDS, poverty, migrant labour, etc. In terms of street children and the literature on that, it tends to emerge around survival strategies on the streets, hierarchical power relations among street young people for creating subordination, and also in relation to earning and sex work. So our research followed a participatory research approach, and we engaged in qualitative longitudinal research, following this idea that young people are active agents shaping their own lives, and we ascertained that street children and youth not only have the right to be involved in decisions that affect their lives, but should be leading and directing their futures. So we had an in-depth ethnographic approach to understand the minutiae of daily life, emotions, relationships, the difficulties and realities. So young people were both investigators and participants in the research, working with researchers and as researchers. In each of the 3 countries, we have a street worker project manager who works with 6 young people who are working as researchers while they are currently living on the streets. And they are undertaking their own participatory ethnography, working with groups of 10 in their network. And this material is discussed and recorded on a weekly basis for the 3-year period. We're also doing focus groups and baseline surveys as well. We did run some training sessions for young people to develop their active listening skills and to discuss problems with being part of that research process. And I can talk more about that if you want to hear more about it later. But moving on then to some of the emerging issues that are coming out in the data. Perhaps one of the most obvious connections to make between street life and sexual exploitation is around requirements to meet basic needs. Sex can be traded for a very small amount of money, where hunger is overwhelming. Now, because many of the girls in Bukavu are engaging in prostitution, the particular nature of this exploitation remains somewhat hidden. And I think the quotes that I've put up on the slide really help to bring home the conditions under which girls agree to engage in sex, demonstrating what might be conceived as work to some is exceptionally exploitative in this case. So, for example, I have sex because of hunger and poverty. When you are hungry, you cannot think twice, even for 500 francs, which is a very small amount of money. And I apologise, I don't have the direct conversion, but a very small amount of money. You can have sex provided that you get some food. So you can see here there's a major issue around basic needs. And then in relation to safety, the results are also highlighting exploitative contexts occurring on the street, particularly in relation to sleep, trading free sex for a safe place to sleep. And these places are not necessarily even safe, but a trade-off exploitation for potential abuse occurs where girls don't want to be alone on the streets at night because of violence and physical and sexual violence. And so the hidden nature of this exploitation again becomes apparent. Quote 2, for example, discusses boys talking about how they helped a girl who had got stranded, took her to sleep with them, but then they traded a cloth to keep her warm in return for sex. And also in relation to movement, safety and movement, where exploitation can be a little bit more of a deliberate act. The girls often talked about thugs, young men being described as thugs, stopping them moving on the streets and only letting them pass in return for sex. And the last two examples also highlight how policemen or watchmen will rescue girls from these thugs, yet still in return for sexual favours and to avoid more violence on the streets. And then thirdly, in relation to earning, and perhaps the examples I've given so far, it's maybe easier to identify sexual exploitation in return for food or safety. But when it comes to the context of work, our data highlights significant exploitative contexts, showing that it's difficult to clearly differentiate between abuse, exploitation, and agentive capacities of work. Girls talk about getting stuck in sex work, where the money is not sufficient in return for very difficult, hard work, as they talk about it. But it also goes beyond receiving little pay, and results in additional services that might be unknown. So negotiating a price with one man can result in being tricked into situations with multiple men, for example, and they often talked about child sex being a major problem. And then my last point is around futures and exploitation. And here the girls talked about their desire to change their futures, which was particularly one of the things we were looking at in relation to the capabilities framework, but saw prostitution as their only option. And although it may seem like an exercise of agency or agentive power, the fact that there was no other options available highlights this exploitative context. So having to pay school fees through engaging in sex work. So just in terms of pulling this together a little bit, I wanted to think about the sort of agency exploitation nexus. And our data does show that girls are employing their agency, if you like, but it's interwoven with exploitation. And so it's placing girls at significant risk. The quotes highlight that these agency or agentive characteristics to exploitation, but that sex in these contexts is exploitative because of the very constrained nature of this agency. Natasha Clocker's term thin agency springs to mind, where agency is severely limited due to structural processes or wider constraints. And so girls may engage in relational encounters in order to gain from sexual encounters, or to trick people into this in order to steal from them, but placing themselves at extreme risk from stigma, revenge, or illness. And so I think some of the things that I wanted to try and pull together was around these points that need further exploration. Exploitation appears to be relational in the streets. It's often carried out by those known to the girls or people that they befriend. Agency is important because we need to think about this as particularly constrained. And it's often hidden, enmeshed within the context of work, where the boundaries between work, which might be seen as expressing agency, and abuse, which is forced, are very blurred. And so the hidden nature of exploitation is much more to the fore here because of the way in which this work is needing to be undertaken to meet basic survival needs. And so we're starting to think about this as a process that's non-linear, that you can't really have these bounded definitions, particularly on the streets and in relation to how sexual exploitation occurs there.